Good morning, and welcome to Seattle Atheist Church. Atheist, agnostic, skeptic, whatever you like to call yourself, you are welcome here. At Seattle Atheist Church, we call ourselves an atheist church because you will never hear anything supernatural promoted from the podium. Our church was founded on the principles of scientific naturalism and secular ethics. Truth claims are attempted here, and we stand ready to revise our thinking in light of new information. We attempt to be excellent to all conscious beings, and we believe in good, because good works in non-mysterious ways. If that sounds right to you, then you are probably in the right place. So the way we do it is quarterly. We have a planning meeting. The members ourselves give the talks. Everyone is invited to the planning meeting. Members ourselves give the talks, and then afterwards we'll have a brief discussion. We are going to finish at 1:30, is that right? And then we have some more time for standing around and talking, but we have to be out by 1:55. If you enjoy coming to church, we have a donation jar at the back of the room, and you can also donate off of the website, seattleatheist.church. Those donations make it possible for us to rent the room. And we also have some goals, such as we'd like to have a presence at some of the street fairs and things like that. So we're trying to build up a little bit of extra money. The first Friday of the month, we have movie night. Please sign up if you'd like to join us. Second Sunday is board games. And the third is Saturday of the month. We have our secular social at Browers at 3 o'clock. Everyone is invited. So thanks very much, Stephen. Come on up.
All right. Great. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time today to come. So, ideas have consequences. A bad idea can result in millions of deaths. And for example, cure for smallpox, all by itself, as we know, has saved millions of lives. That's a good idea. That's a good thing. A bad idea, on the other hand, can result in millions of deaths. What I'm going to talk about today is an idea that I think is not only bad, but also very dangerous. And I'm going to talk about the relationship between science and morality. So let me start by telling you a story. I'm going to tell you a story of back in 1984, and Stephen Jay Gould at the time was invited to visit the Vatican. Stephen Jay Gould is a famous Harvard paleontologist, biologist, writer, really great science writer. He was invited to the Vatican to talk about nuclear winter. He went there. Carl Sagan was with him. It's kind of fun to imagine them hanging out, in Rome and going to restaurants and having a great time in Rome. But he was invited for this science meeting, and while he was there was a table of Jesuit priests who invited him over, and they had a question for him. What they asked is, what they wanted to know was going on in America with all this talk about scientific creationism. One asked me, is evolution really in some kind of trouble? And if so, what could such trouble be? I've always been taught that no doctrinal conflict exists between evolution and the Catholic faith, and the evidence for evolution seems both entirely satisfactory and utterly overwhelming. Have I missed something? So, this is a table of Jesuit priests. Weird thing is, keep in mind, Stephen Jay Gould is a Jewish agnostic. So it's also kind of weird that he's at the Vatican answering questions about Christianity. But anyway, but he jumped in, and Gould's response was, creationism does not pit science against religion, for no such conflict exists. Creationism does not raise any unsettled intellectual issues about the nature of biology or the history of life. Creationism is a local and parochial movement, powerful only in the United States among Western nations, and prevalent only among the few sectors of American Protestantism that choose to read the Bible as an inerrant document, literally true in every jot and tittle. I love that phrase, jot and tittle. So what he's basically saying here, his response was, oh, no, don't worry about the creationists. They're just a small group of people, and most people don't take the Bible literally. It's just this crazy subsect that we have in America. Gould continues, creationism based on biblical literalism makes little sense in either Catholicism or Judaism, for neither religion maintains any extensive tradition for reading the Bible as literal truth, rather than illuminating literature based partly on metaphor and allegory, which are essential components of all good writing, and demanding interpretation for proper understanding. Most Protestant groups, of course, take the same position, the fundamentalist fringe notwithstanding. The position that I have outlined by personal stories and general statements represents the standard attitude of all major Western religions and of Western science. Today, the lack of conflict between science and religion arises from a lack of overlap between their respective domains of professional expertise. Science in the empirical constitution of the universe, and religion in the search for proper ethical values and the spiritual meaning of our lives. So, here the idea is, no, there's no conflict at all. Science has its domain, and then religion has its domain, and I don't know what all the fuss is about. This is where Gould introduces this notion of non-overlapping magisteria. And so this is, he made up this use of the word. So let me explain what he means by it. He uses the acronym NOMA to refer to it, non-overlapping magisterium, which is a little easier to say. So I might start using NOMA. The net of science covers the empirical universe. What it is made of, fact. And why does it work this way, theory. The net of religion extends over questions of moral meaning and value. These two magisteria do not overlap, nor do they encompass all inquiry. Consider, for starters, the magisterium of art and the meaning of beauty. To cite the arch cliches, this statement drives me crazy, but to cite the arch cliches, we get the age of rocks, and religion retains the rock of ages. We study how the heavens go, and they determine how to go to heaven. Oh, man. Okay, so he coined this word magisterium from the Latin magistar, or teacher. And the idea is it represents a domain of authority. So again, the idea here is there's just two completely different domains of authority. You have sort of religion and morals and all that on one side, and you have science over there on the other side. And they never meet. So some people have somewhat cynical, whatever, have suggested that Gould divided the universe in this way as a way to save science in the face of creationism. That was just a smart political move. But Gould has insisted multiple times that that's not true at all. He writes, NOMA represents a principled position on moral and intellectual grounds, not a mere diplomatic stance. NOMA also cuts both ways. If religion can no longer dictate the nature of factual conclusions properly under the magisterium of science, then scientists cannot claim higher insight into moral truth from any superior knowledge of the world's empirical constitution. So that's a pretty strong statement. Science can't help us with moral truths, basically. Okay. So I wanted to see some examples of this. So what I'm citing here, these paragraphs are actually from Gould's original paper. He wrote on non-overlapping magisteria back in, I think it was 1984 or so. Later in 1999, he wrote a book called Rock of Ages, where he expands out on the ideas of NOMA. And the interesting thing about the book is he gives more concrete examples of statements where he thinks, science can't answer the question. So I wanted to give you some examples of that. So here's a quote. Are we worth more than bugs or bacteria because we've evolved a more complex neurology? Under what conditions, if ever, do we have a right to drive other species to extinction by elimination of their habitats? Do we violate any moral codes when we use genetic technology to place a gene from one creature into the genome of another species? Such questions engage different concerns that simply cannot be answered or even much illuminated by factual data of any kind. No measure of mental power in humans versus ants will resolve the first question, and no primer on the technology of lateral genetic transfer will provide much help with the last issue. So his point here is, again, science doesn't help at all in answering these questions of value. There are questions of value completely separate from what a scientist should even be involved in. And notice that he's saying here that, this is questions about animal rights or even animal genocide in this case can't be settled by any factual data at all. So these questions address moral issues about the value and meaning of life, both in human form and more widely construed. Their fruitful discussion must proceed under a different magisterium, far older than science, at least as a formalized inquiry, and dedicated to a quest for consensus, or at least a clarification of assumptions and criteria about ethical ought, that's in quotes, ethical ought, rather than a search for any factual is, in quote, about the material construction of the natural world. So here he's referring explicitly to something called the is-ought distinction, right? And that has, we'll talk about that in a moment, that has a long tradition in philosophy. He footnotes it, he has like this 2-page footnote where he discusses it. Basically, he says, he apologizes to all philosophers for doing a cavalier brush-by of such an old and difficult topic. But the weird thing is, given that the whole book is about really, the fact-value distinction and is and not, it's bizarre that he kind of ignores, the whole tradition of talking about it and just says, that's not my domain. I guess it does fit in with his approach to other things to do that, but it also seems very weird that if you're going to write a book on the is-ought distinction, probably reading up on the literature on the is-ought distinction would be helpful. But before ending this discussion of Gould, I want to emphasize that Gould's not alone in this way of sort of dividing the universe up into the two domains. In fact, I was really surprised to discover that the National Academy of Sciences endorsed this view that Gould has. And this is also something that Sam Harris mentions, that the journal Nature also, the editors of the journal Nature also endorsed Gould's view. So it's a pretty common view among scientists that scientists aren't allowed to talk about morality and values. All right, so I want to spend just a couple minutes talking about the is-ought distinction, because again, that's the basis for, I think, a lot of confusion that people have when they start talking about the whole question of science and morality. And the root of all of this comes from my favorite philosopher of all time, Hume, David Hume. So he's the one who made the is-ought distinction and got everyone talking about it. So the is-ought distinction in philosophy is also called the fact-value distinction, the naturalistic fallacy. There's G.E. Moore's open question argument, but it all derives back from the original ideas that the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher David Hume had. So the weird thing about Hume's discussion of the is-ought distinction is most people misunderstand it in the context of what David Hume is trying to talk about. So most people conclude somehow from Hume's writing that Hume was skeptical about ever deriving a morality based off of a science. A lot of people, when you read their interpretation of Hume, say that Hume says that you can never go from facts about the world to what people ought to do. And that's how they represent Hume's is-ought distinction. But that, on the face of it, would be really strange for a couple of reasons. First, Hume is a famous atheist. We've talked about this before. He was also a naturalist, so it would be kind of odd to interpret it in that way. But also, more directly, the cover of his book, the name of the actual subtitle on his book is An Attempt to Introduce the Experimental Method of Reasoning into Moral Subjects. So that's pretty blunt, that he had the goal of trying to introduce experimental methods into moral subjects. So it's a bizarre interpretation of Hume to say that he was skeptical about basing a morality on science. So let me give you a little bit of background here. Hume made the distinction which we've talked about before. He made a distinction between what he called relations between ideas and matters of facts. And this is a distinction that predates and really founds this analytic synthetic distinction that we've also talked about. But his basic idea here is there's only two ways that humans can come to an understanding of the world. They can come to an understanding of the world by using their powers of reason and deduction, So that's the paradigm example for Hume is geometry, where you have some axioms that you need to do stuff, and that's relations of ideas. So it's just, it's understanding the relationship between things. And then there's matters of fact, and his examples there are all around perception. So looking out, seeing the sky is blue, that's a different way of gaining knowledge about the world. And Hume's mission in the book is to found all of sciences based off of one of those two methods of coming to understanding the world. He thinks, you have to start with a study of human nature, what he calls the science of man, understand human psychology, and from there you have a firm foundation for the rest of your knowledge, because instead of just making stuff up, you have to show how it's either deducible or how the knowledge comes from observation or perception. So I'm giving you this background because I'm going to go ahead and read the paragraph, which people always cite when people talk about Hume's skepticism versus is and not. Here he goes. This is Hume. In every system of morality which I have hitherto met with, I have always remarked that the author proceeds for some time in the ordinary way of reasoning and establishes the being of a god, or makes observations concerning human affairs, when, of a sudden, I am surprised to find that instead of the usual copulations of propositions, is and is not, I meet with no proposition that is not connected with an ought or an ought not. This change is imperceptible, but it is, however, of the last consequence. So what he's saying there is, when he's reading the current moral philosophers of his day, they always do this sneaky, transition between using ought statements about facts, and then they all of a sudden transition into statements about, what you ought to do, statements about values, and he finds that very, very suspicious because there's no rule of logic that allows you to make that transition. That's what's upsetting him here. This is not surprising. Hume does believe that you can't derive ought from is. These are, you can't reason to morality. But that doesn't mean he's skeptical about using science to understand morality. He just thinks that morality is based off of perception. And he's very blunt about this. And I think it's 2 paragraphs below that, he writes, thus the course of the argument leads us to conclude that since vice and virtue are not discoverable merely by reason, or the comparison of ideas, it must be by means of some impression or sentiment they occasion, and that we are able to mark the difference betwixt them. Our decisions concerning moral rectitude and depravity are evidently perceptions, and as all perceptions are either impressions or ideas, the exclusion of the one is a convincing argument for the other. Morality, therefore, is more properly felt than judged of. So that's his. So he's not arguing against coming up with scientific basis for morality. He's saying that it has to be based off of perception, and he draws a direct comparison between morality and your perception of beauty. In both cases, you perceive a moral act that gives you a certain type of emotional reaction, approbation. If you see something beautiful, that gives you a certain emotional reaction, the emotion of beauty that you're experiencing in the face of beauty. So he's not making a skeptical argument here. Instead, what he's doing is he's just trying to claim that you can't, purely through reason alone, come up with a general theory of morality. All right, so that's all I'm going to say about the is-ought distinction. I just wanted to say enough to say that you should be skeptical when people refer to Hume, for example, as supporting the is-ought distinction. But, what?
Isn't the is-ought distinction his thing? What do you mean supporting that is-ought?
So saying that you can't, so let me clarify. So Hume believed that he couldn't derive ought from is, but he didn't believe that morality was a function of reason. So later philosophers like Kant, for example, Immanuel Kant, wanted to use reason as a justification for morality. They thought you could reason to morality by making universal statements, but that's different from Hume, who's a empiricist, and who doesn't believe that you can use your relations of ideas, the power of deduction, to be able to explain what morality is. So, said more carefully, that's correct. But the general idea is that a lot of people have thought that Hume was skeptical about having any science of morality at all, but he's just skeptical about a certain approach to coming up with a science of morality. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, but let's return to Gould and NOMA, the non-overlapping Magisteria. So Sam Harris, in his book, The Moral Landscape, argues directly against the idea of NOMA. He writes, Gould's underlying claim is that while science is the best authority on the workings of the physical universe, religion is the best authority on meaning, values, morality, and the good life. I hope to persuade you that this is not only untrue, it cannot possibly be true. Meaning, values, morality, and the good life must relate to facts about the well-being of conscious creatures, in our case must lawfully depend upon events in the world and upon states of the human brain. So Harris has a pretty simple argument in his book. This is again from The Moral Landscape, why Gould has to be wrong. And let me lay out his argument. For my argument about the moral landscape to hold, I think one need only grant 2 points. Number 1, some people have better lives than others. Number 2, these differences relate in some lawful and not entirely arbitrary way to states of the human brain and to states of the world. So it says if you accept those 2 propositions, and this whole idea of non-overlapping magisteria just doesn't make sense. And here's his argument for it. It's a really simple argument. So what he does is he compares 2 lives. And he says that everyone would agree that one life is bad and one life is good. And if you can't make that distinction, you probably shouldn't be wasting time talking to that person, because they're so far away from normal human sort of psychology and perception that it's not clear how the argument would proceed. But let me lay out the 2 lives. So here's the bad life. Trigger warning. Oh, trigger. Oh, yeah. So it's really, really bad. So cover your ears if I don't know. It's as bad as you can imagine. All right. So you are a young widow who has lived her entire life in the midst of civil war. I'm going to skip this part because it's really bad, but it involves machetes and gangs of drug-addled soldiers. Okay, you are now running barefoot through the jungle with killers in pursuit. See, even that by itself is bad enough. While this is the worst day of your life, it is not entirely out of character with the other days of your life. It not only sucks now, it sucks all the time. Since the moment you were born, your world has been a theater of cruelty and violence. You have never learned to read, taken a hot shower, or traveled beyond the green hell of the jungle. Even the luckiest people you have known have experienced little more than an occasional respite from chronic hunger, fear, apathy, and confusion. Unfortunately, you've been very unlucky, even by these bleak standards. Your life has been one long emergency, and now it is nearly over. So really, really bad. Just, imagine the worst possible life presented out. Okay, so that's the bad life. Now, here's the good life. Hopefully these should be good triggers. Here's the good life. You are married to the most loving, intelligent, and charismatic person you have ever met. Both of you have careers that are intellectually stimulating and financially rewarding. For decades, your wealth and social connections have allowed you to devote yourself to activities that bring you immense personal satisfaction. One of your greatest sources of happiness has been to find creative ways to help people who have not had your good fortune in life. In fact, you have just won $1 billion grant, of course you have, to benefit children in the developing world. If asked, you would say that you could not imagine how your time on earth could be better spent. Due to a combination of good genes and optimal circumstances, you and your closest friends and family will live very long, healthy lives, untouched by crime, sudden bereavements, and other misfortunes. All right, so I just want to take a quick poll. How many people in the room want the bad life? How many people want the good life? Okay. Anyone did put their hand up? All right. I didn't put my hand up. You did? Oh, man. Okay, this is great. We're going to have to talk about this in discussion time. All right. So anyway, so Harris writes, the moment one grants there's a difference between the bad life and the good life that lawfully relates to states of the human brain, to human behavior, and to states of the world, one has admitted that there are right and wrong answers to questions of morality. In other words, one has undermined Gould's distinction between the 2 magisteriums. Another argument. So Harris's argument is based off of looking at individual lives. Another person who responds to Gould, not surprisingly, is Steven Pinker. And Steven Pinker thinks of it not at the level of individuals, but of course at the level of societies, right? Saying that one society can demonstrably be shown to be better than another society, or more importantly, that all of human society has gone through human progress, and our lives now are demonstrably better than our lives were even 50 years ago, or even 100 years ago. He writes about this. Pinker has 2 books. The Better Angels of Our Nature and Enlightenment Now, where he talks about human progress. So what he writes is, the world has made spectacular progress in every single measure of human well-being. We live longer, we are healthier, we are safer, we are wealthier, we are freer, we are smarter, and we are happier. I'm not going to go through all this because we had a previous sermon where we went through all the stats for it. They're pretty impressive. So I'm just going to assume all of that. But I did want to just focus on one area, child mortality. So just to cite one example, according to Pinker, for the majority of human history, a substantial percentage of children died before reaching adulthood. For example, in traditional hunter-gatherer societies, half of all children died before adulthood. And even in a wealthy country such as Sweden, between 1/3 and 1/4 of the children died well into the 19th century. So we're not talking, ancient times here. We're talking until relatively recently. If you've ever read, like Darwin's biography or Huxley's biography, they have so many children who die in these biographies. It's just because it was so common back then for children to die, during childbirth or while they're young through accidents or all sorts of different things, diseases. That's just, a standard part of life back then, which is really sad. But then a remarkable thing happened. The child mortality rate plunged by 100-fold. There is not a single country today where the child mortality rate is not lower than it was in the 1950s. Pinker writes, the loss of a child is among the most devastating experiences. Imagine the tragedy. Then try to imagine it another 1,000,000 times. That's 1/4 of the number of children who did not die last year alone, who would have died had they been born 15 years earlier. Now repeat 200 times or so for the years since the decline in child mortality began. Graphs, like the one in figure 5.2, which shows the decline in mortality rates, display a triumph of human well-being whose magnitude the mind cannot begin to comprehend, which is absolutely true, right? Given this, who would trade their life to live in an earlier time? I mean, again, not me. Wouldn't want to live in an earlier time because on all the different dimensions, life was just more miserable. So Pinker discusses Gould's argument explicitly for non-overlapping magisteria. He writes, Gould's entente unravels as soon as you begin to examine it. The moral worldview of any scientifically literate person, one who is not blinkered by fundamentalism, requires a clean break from religious conceptions of meaning and value. To begin with, the findings of science imply that the belief systems of all the world's traditional religions and cultures, their theories of the genesis of the world, life, humans, and societies, are factually mistaken. There is no such thing as fate, providence, karma, spells, curses, augury, divine retribution, or answered prayers. In other words, the worldview that guides the moral and spiritual values of a knowledgeable person today is a worldview given to us by science. The scientific facts militate toward a defensible morality, namely principles that maximize the flourishing of humans and other sentient beings, which is, by the way, very similar to Sam Harris. This humanism, which is inextricable from a scientific understanding of the world, is becoming the de facto morality of modern democracies, international organizations, and liberalizing religions, and its unfulfilled promises define the moral imperatives we face today. Okay, so I want to get to the conclusion, so we have time to discuss. So just to summarize, in the first part of this talk, I talked about Stephen Jay Gould's non-overlapping Magisterium, Magisteria. And then I spent a little bit of time talking about the origins of this fact-value, non-overlapping Magisteria is-ought distinction in David Hume's A Treatise on Human Nature. Talked a little bit about Sam Harris's response to Gould. Sam Harris is focused on individuals, and Pinker really is saying the same thing at the level of societies. As I said at the beginning of the talk, ideas matter. Believing that science can lead to moral progress, improve human flourishing, is itself very important for moral progress. Please spread this idea, because again, good ideas have good effects. What's our creed? Good works in non-mysterious ways. Thank you. Yeah. All right. Let's discuss.